My guest today is director John Madden. We talked to him about the making of his new film, Miss Sloane. Jessica Chasten acts as a powerful Washington, D.C. lobbyist in the film. Madden previously directed Shakespeare in Love, Mrs. Brown, and The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel Part 1 and 2. Here is our interview with John Madden. Welcome to San Francisco and welcome to a place that has, I guess you have some kind of connection with ILM.
I do have a connection with ILM. I worked here on developing ideas for a movie that in the end I couldn't do, but it was very fascinating. Yeah, I was working on the early ideas and designs and proof of concept and so forth on the BFG, whose script I developed over a long time with Melissa Matheson, the late, great Melissa Matheson.
But you also did something with Star Wars.
Oh, I did. Okay, that's going further back. Yes, that's a long connection I had with Lucasfilm. I was actually over in this country working on a radio drama project, which seemed an eccentric idea at the time because radio drama had disappeared since the Orson Welles days when radio went commercial in this country, and therefore music and current affairs became the only output and radio drama disappeared. So I worked via the BBC, where I had been working, developing a script department to revive that as a medium. We did some very interesting work, and we were then approached because George Lucas who was a great fan of radio drama, gave the radio rights to Star Wars to his alma mater, which is KUSC, University of Southern California, and as you know, obviously all of the public radio network are all associated with universities in this country. So KUSC had this extraordinary kind of property and didn't quite know what to do with it and didn't know how to go about it. And they approached us to say, would we consider getting involved in creating these things? So initially we did a 13-part adaptation of Star Wars, and subsequently about a year and a half, 2 years later, did Empire Strikes Back, and finally Return of the Jedi. It was actually called Revenge of the Jedi. Not many people know that. Well, I guess Star Wars fans do. When we started to work on it, but the name was eventually changed. So yes, they still exist and they're still available.
So you've had a very interesting career. You started with drama, then you've done TV, and now you're doing films, and you've done a whole range of films, Shakespeare in Love and the exotic Marigold movie set in India. And I was going to say, the opening line before I said, welcome to San Francisco, I was going to say, it takes teamwork to make a dream works, Mummy G. And I was going to say Madden G.
Yes. Well, yes, it's a rich and varied career, not for me to say. I don't necessarily want to confine myself to one kind of thing. I mean, actually, I would say the thread that runs through everything I've done, and actually I began my career in the theatre, really. I suppose radio drama initially, but I ran a theatre company before that, and then worked in this country, in the US, for quite a long time, directing theatre.
Did you come here in 75?
I came here in 75, and we lived here. I came here just after I married and had 2 children here with my wife, who then wanted to go back to bring up the children in England. And although I was slightly less keen to do that at the time because I had a career that was developing quite, I suppose, excitingly here at that point. I'm extremely glad I did that. Not because I didn't want to live here. I did want to live here and went on working here, but wanted to be back in the place where we belong, I suppose. So, so I did a lot of theatre here, and it then went back to learn really filmmaking in the UK started working really in British television, which was its own little kind of independent film studio at the time. A lot of their drama output was made on film. It was very writer-driven. material driven. In other words, protected from the requirements of commercial success. And I suppose it gave me a respect for the material, and I think perhaps I developed a reputation for being somebody who understood narrative in a certain way and character in a certain way. And on stage, nobody can see you. If you direct King Lear, you don't have to go on directing tragedy for the rest of your life. It goes with the territory that you can also do comedy and contemporary work and period work and so forth. And I suppose I just carried that sensibility into film. The first film I made was an American classic, Ethan Frome, which is a small rural tragedy of great intensity. Then I made a film nobody's seen called Golden Gate in this city. That was a curious kind of theatrical hybrid, but very cinematic at the same time. Didn't really get seen by anybody. Then I made a film called Mrs. Brown, which is definitely landed on the map and I guess introduced the world to Judi Dench as a screen actor. And then Shakespeare in Love came about because of that, which was a comedy, and in a world that I knew very, very well. That had a lot to do with my theatrical career and I suppose my education. So it's just things develop in a certain way, and I would say character is the key relationship in all the films that I do, including this one.
So Miss Sloane is such an interesting film. It takes a hard-nosed look at lobbyists and lobbying, and you basically remove the veil and show us how lobbyists work. And since you worked in theater, it looks like you worked with actual lobbyists to figure out how the whole thing works. You wanted your facts straight.
We certainly did want to get that straight. I mean, the script by Jonathan Pereira, which is a fairly extraordinary debut script. It literally is the first script, more or less, that he wrote. I think he wrote a couple of higher concept pieces that he put in a bottom drawer and it's never taken out again. But he's a sort of autodidact who just started teaching himself how to do it. But one thing he is a very meticulous researcher, and he had also worked briefly before he gave that up to go start writing films, worked in an international law firm. And lobbying is a sort of an outreach. Often, it's a division of a larger legal practice. And obviously advocacy generally is the sort of umbrella title that covers what both, more conventional law does and what lobbying does. So that was the first part of the process. It was a very well-observed piece in that way. As we started to work on the script more and to challenge more forensically some of the assumptions in the story, we started to work with political consultants just to check that we weren't, wet behind the ears on it or overly naive or overly unrealistic. So just to be clear, it is a fictional piece. It's a work of imagination. But the world it describes and the world it deals with is not imaginary in any way. But we sort of float free of an exact circumstance. It's most of this kind of movie would characteristically be expected to be based on a true story. This is based on an extrapolation of a circumstance. It's about a piece of gun legislation working its way through Congress.
So you mentioned Jonathan Pereira. I was going to hold off on that and ask you. He has a very interesting backstory. His story itself could be a movie.
Yes.
He was teaching in South Korea when he sat down to write this, and he sent the script. And apparently Film Nation floated the script, and your instincts kicked in and you thought that there was a good story. And you are a big believer in instincts.
Yes.
What was the title of the script when it landed at your desk?
It was called Miss Sloane at that point. So it didn't make a huge transition. I just felt that gave off a slightly odd kind of flavor. It's not as pronounceable, easily pronounceable. It's heavily ironic in the piece. She's not a character who would ever expect to be referred to by a title that implied, her marital status. But it is the term that's used all the way through the film. Yes, Jonathan Pereira is unusual. He just to clarify that, he grew up in my country, in the UK, in fairly unusual circumstances. His mother was a refugee from Soviet-controlled Czechoslovakia, as it was then, and brought up her two sons single-handedly, really. He got an education, very good education, but a state education, went to the University of London, studied law, which he had no interest in beyond figuring out that it would be the quickest way to repay his university debt. So he went into a job, well paid, quite impressive job with an international law firm, working in not very interesting areas. And as soon as he'd earned enough money to pay off his university debt, he quit the job and went to work in Southeast Asia. He taught in China for a while, taught himself Chinese, and taught that he has connections with that part of the world. His mother now lives there. Lives in Malaysia. And he took a job teaching elementary school children in South Korea, another language he taught himself, in order specifically to give himself time to write. And he lived very frugally, had a sort of modus operandi. I think there was a website that you used to be able to go to read unproduced film scripts. I think copyright issues have now resulted in that being shut down. And he would read a screenplay, first 60 pages in the morning, go to school, do his job, and during the course of the day, in his idle moments, he'd try and figure out how he would complete that story and write the second half of it, and then read the second half the following day and compare notes, as it were. Anyway, he saw a documentary about a now infamous and disgraced political lobbyist called Jack Abramoff, who was the subject of a BBC show that he stumbled over called Hard Talk, which you have over here. And he suddenly thought, that's an interesting milieu for a film. I don't think I've seen a film about a lobbyist.
Does Sackor know that his Hard Talk was the inspiration for this movie?
Stephen Sacker, I don't know whether he does, actually. Maybe I'll encounter him at some point. But that is absolutely true. That's what it was. And I think he then set about researching the world and constructing the basic narrative. And the narrative is very unusual and very startling. I read the script, as you described. He sent the script out. It'll take too long to go into exactly how that happened, but he basically sent the script into, the Hollywood environment, not Hollywood particularly, but, Los Angeles, as a sort of log line, a cold query. And somebody called him, who has now become his manager, and said, I like this, let's Skype. And he worked on the script a little bit, and then it went out as a spec script, essentially, without him ever having met his manager or ever having met his representation. And when I became involved in it, it landed on my in my inbox, as it were, as a log line, and I was immediately intrigued by it, because I'm a bit of a sucker for American politics, and particularly baffled by the issue of gun legislation. I never could quite get my head around how that worked. So I read it and was just instantly compelled by it. I thought it was an extraordinary unpacking of a very unusual world. Had an amazing role in it, which I immediately could see the actress I've cast in it before I got to page 15. I thought of her, and by the time I finished the script, I sent it to her immediately, because we'd been looking for something to do together since the other film I did with her, The Debt, which is another thriller, actually.
Yes, I've seen The Debt. We just have a minute left. What is it about Jessica Chasten that drew you? Because she acted as the young Helen Mirren in The Debt, I believe.
Yes, she did.
You talk about her being transparent as an actor.
Yes, she is. There's a group of actors, and she belongs absolutely in that company, that are just extraordinarily magnetic, but at the same time disappear into the roles that they're playing, as opposed to retaining, an unmistakable quality that has to do with their own personality. Jessica can transform completely,
So
and
they become the role.
yes, she becomes the role and inhabits it completely. But she's extremely skilled, very, very, very intelligent, meticulous in her research. This part needed a level of verbal dexterity that I knew she would be able to have. But chiefly, she is able. I knew she would be able to dominate the world of the film, and she does. It's an absolutely extraordinary performance, without completely losing a sense of humanity and a sense of fragility that actually is an important component. Not something you suspect in the first 10 minutes of the film as she, cuts a swathe through Washington. But it's the contrast of those two qualities that I think make her so compelling in it. She's a character you're both withdraw in some kind of amazement and even horror at the way she does things, but at the same time you're pulled towards her, and you start increasingly, as the film unfolds, to root for her more and more and more.
I liked watching the film, and I said it had to take two British guys to make this film. But I was left wanting to know more. There's no backstory of Miss Sloane, so is there a sequel in the making?
No, I'm of the view. I think it's one of the sort of failings of Hollywood orthodoxy that you have to explain everything that happens to a character or why they behave the way they do in terms of a backstory. Jessica brings that backstory in terms of what happens in the performance, and I think she's not a character who relates to her own emotional life in any way. She's not even aware of it. She's locked it away as a sort of unwelcome distraction in terms of getting the things done that she wants to have done. Bizarre parallels here with, a certain other female figure who's just been through, the ringer of the political process finally. And I think it's... where the film has to pause in order to explain what she experienced in childhood that's made her into the person that she is not a scene I'm generally interested in, and I don't usually believe. I think what you need to believe is the way a character is behaving and understand it. And if the film is allowing you to do that, and there is, I won't give the game away here as to how that happens, but we do have an insight into her emotional life through the most unusual form in this story. That's something else you haven't seen on film very often. And I think that's intriguing in and of itself. A lot of people have said, are you going to make this into a series, because it's slightly open-ended at the end? But that's because everybody's trained to think that way. It has its own perfect shape for a film, I think.
Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You were listening to an interview with film director John Madden on the making of his new film, Miss Sloane. You can download this and other podcasts from our website or from iTunes. You can watch our TV shows on our YouTube channel, and I'm on Twitter. My handle is @Kamla. If you have any questions, suggestions, or feedback, please feel free to send them to us. And as always, thank you for tuning in.